You're in a good place now. You are listening to Perspectives with Ashley Berges.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I'm your host, Ashley Berges. You know, on today's show, we're going to be talking about the rites of passage. You know, many times we don't realize that there are so many cultures out there that have ceremonies for the rites of passage, even more so making those changes in our life. You know, we often find ourselves in situations in life that we're unhappy, or we have to make a change, or a change comes to us with not necessarily our selection of that change. We have to overcome it, we have to process it, we have to get through it, and we have to move on. But many times we don't allow that change and process to come in itself as a rite of passage. I feel that oftentimes we try to skirt the issue, we try to run from change, we try to just get to the next step no matter what. And when I work with my clients, both therapy and for coaching, I have a tendency of seeing when people are making major life changes, the sacredness of it's really not there, as well as the ability to recognize the fact that we all have, I believe, several lifetimes within one lifetime. I believe that we can make changes to our life, we can create what we want, and sometimes we don't realize that because of the way we were raised or the way we were brought up, because we were brought up to believe in a certain system, a limiting system of beliefs for that matter. And so, you know, when you think about these types of thoughts, and I think deeply very often, as you know, on this show, when I do bring someone on the show, I want that person to be able to talk directly about the specific subject matter to make it more interesting, but also to explain it in a way that I think needs to be explained for us to understand, but better yet, for us to implement it in our own life. Joining me live in studio, Emerald Peaceful Greenforest, the Empress of Encouragement, just wrote a book, The Wisdom Winks to Make You Think, success quotes for the life of your business and the business of your life, and also a good friend of mine. Emerald, great to have you in studio today.
Ashley, it is my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
You know, we were talking on the phone a couple of weeks back, and we were talking about when people make changes in their life, when they go through major life changes, you know, whether that's a divorce or a change in a career or anything for that matter, or just a change in thought. And you brought up the concept of the rite of passage, and I find it very interesting. Let's start there.
Sure. Let's start there. So, you know, in our culture, we have some rites of passage that we actually do recognize. So, for example, like when you go first to school, when you first go off to school, that's kind of a rite of passage. When you graduate from school, that's a rite of passage. When you have your first date, that's a rite of passage. But we don't necessarily treat these rites of passage in a sacred way. And as we mature and as we grow, we discover that life is constantly a process and a dance of change. And when we are able to acknowledge kind of the sacredness of the change process, and when we are able to acknowledge and mark significant changes in a conscious and ceremonial way, we really get to harness the power of the transformation and anchor that transformation much more fully, where we kind of bring our whole self to the transformation. Whereas if we ignore the fact that it's a rite of passage, or we don't mark it with some kind of ceremonial experience, then it's almost like we're leaving scattered parts of ourselves behind that we haven't acknowledged, and then we end up more in a shattered place than in a whole place. So these rites of passage actually give us the capacity to come to full, clean completion and closure with one aspect of our life, and then harness the power from that and move forward into what we're creating next, fully charged with all of our power and with the full awareness that we are in a new place and not still, part of us is still stuck in that old place. Hope that made sense.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. I feel a lot of times we gloss over the things that are huge in our life, or we neglect them, or we kind of rush through them without really, feeling it and being in it and making that choice. And I see people do it all the time coming into my office. It's, whether it was a divorce that they went through, or a change in life, or maybe a health scare, or maybe, whatever that looks like. And we didn't really take the time to process it, and we often don't see the lessons that we need to learn from it as well.
Exactly. And I think part of the challenge, at least in our culture, is that we have culturally started to eviscerate the sacredness and the validity of actually feeling our feelings. So I'll give you an example. I actually took on a new client recently, somebody who was going to get married, and then it became clear that that was not going to happen. And as a result of the circumstances which showed this person that getting married was not going to be the choice, that was not going to be this person's rite of passage, right before getting the clarity, the person actually made a suicide attempt. And so there was this part of this person's life that really was calling to die. And in this person's case, they did not succeed with the suicide, but it did become clear that the relationship had to die. And so when they came to work with me, one of the things that happened was they wanted to do exactly what you said, which is, I just want to move on. I just want to start something new. I just want to be productive. I just want to, just keep going, right? And the work that we are doing right now is I'm actually working with this person to help them acknowledge this death, that that dream of getting married is no longer going to be energized, and to really retract the power from everything that was created that led up to this moment, this rite of passage, to bring it back into the present, to bring it forward actually into the present, so that they can actually create a new life, but create this new life with consciousness. And so part of our work together is I'm taking them through a rite of passage, a death rite of passage, so that there can be a rebirth. And I like to call this stopping well in a startup world. Our world is very much focused on the startup. And how do we stop well so that we can create what's next from a place of fullness rather than a place of brokenness?
I like that. I do think that more so than ever in this country, and I believe around the world, one of the things we don't do very well is process things. I feel that I think a lot of people have been sold a bill of goods that you're not supposed to be mindful, or maybe they don't know how. I also feel to some degree that when it's something that's not necessarily amazing or awesome, it's like our whole world seems to be based on accolades and the successes that we have. And it seems that when we look at certain things in our life, we see them as miserable or failures. And it seems that most people try to even avoid processing it. And I also feel to some degree it's almost avoidance altogether. And I see that as a country as a whole, when you're just talking about the United States, I think one of the themes is avoidance. Avoiding our feelings, avoiding anything that's gone that hasn't been at the best, the kudos, the success. And so how do you feel about when somebody is going through a changing process, that they might be questioning things? What is some advice that you feel that they need to be aware of, or something that they need to be aware of just to kind of stop and reformat a thought, getting out of that same way we've always done it, and begin to, I guess, not only self-soothe, but basically take that step back and say, okay, what do I need to process from this moment in time?
Yeah, perfect question. And I love that you brought up the topic of avoidance, because that's exactly right. There's this immense amount of energy around the transformation process. And so if we just think about like the butterfly, the caterpillar going into the butterfly, there is so much energy that gets consumed to create that transformation. But if we are avoiding the transformation, not only do we end up actually staying stuck in our old form, but we also oftentimes end up self-harming rather than self-soothing. So, either, with addiction or generally speaking, addiction and addiction issues are what come up when we're in those places of self-harming. So what we need to do is we need to stop and acknowledge that something needs to change. And the truth is, when you know that you're in a significant change process, you actually do know it. You actually do know it. And so the first step is to acknowledge, to just really say, oh, I am feeling. I have a friend, one of my yoga teachers, and she calls it feeling the squeeze. She'll say, I'm feeling the squeeze, right? So at least by acknowledging that she's feeling the squeeze, that's the beginning point. Without the acknowledgement, then we're literally running on kind of what I would call automatic pilot. And we're staying in this like hamster in the wheel kind of dynamic, and we never actually come through the rite of passage, and we never actually make the transformation. So this is why, for example, there are people who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s who are still functionally psychologically, emotionally, mentally, developmentally, they're still acting as if they're 7, 8, 9, 12, 13, the jilted teenager, whatever. They're still stuck in that that frame of being, and they have yet to move through a rite of passage to mature. So awareness is healing. So the first thing we must do is we must acknowledge if we're in doing the pattern thing, like same guy, different face, right? Or if we're in the pattern thing where maybe it's a job thing, same situation, like, oh my God, the last job I had somebody who was a bully, this job I have somebody who's a bully. If you keep seeing the same patterns coming up, and I'll use myself as an example. It took me actually until 2 years ago before I finally acknowledged that I was the single unifying thread across my whole life. I had a pattern of relationship after relationship after relationship with men who were either abusive, addicted, or that I felt alienated from. And that included my dad, who was an alcoholic. It included various husbands, I call them my husbands, who were abusive and alcoholics and addicted, had addiction issues. Mm-hmm. It included business partners who were abusive, bullying, angry men. And it ultimately included my own son, who went from being this amazing, radiant, incredibly gifted and sensitive child to, as he went into manhood, into puberty, which physically he was going through the rite of passage, but our culture has crappy rites of passage for our men, especially. As he was going through the puberty process, there was no good rite of passage to help him step into manhood. And so he ended up following down his father's footsteps of addiction and anger and ultimately depression and suicidal ideation and all kinds of other things. And it wasn't until he actually locked me in the basement and threatened to kill me that I had my wake-up call that I was the single unifying thread in all of those abusive relationships. And I was able to acknowledge that. And then because I finally acknowledged that, then I could move to the next step, which is conscious ceremony, to make a rite of passage for myself out of the old dynamic that no longer served.
That's very powerful, Emerald. Let me ask you, so you're at that position right now, you know, your son has locked you in the basement, right? And then and then you're figuring out exactly what you need to do. What was the light that came on? Okay, what was that initial, can you think about besides the fact of, oh my God, I'm trapped here, but what was the initial situation that just kind of put that light on and you went, oh, yeah, it's right there, bam. You know?
So what happened was prior to this moment, for about 2 weeks before this moment, I actually was on stage and I did a ceremony in a group with a bunch of participants at an event where I literally took them through a shedding ceremony, and I was wearing a snakeskin dress and everything, right? Mm-hmm. So I took them through this shedding process, and so I participated in that ceremony of shedding myself. And on the plane home, I had an intuitive piece of guidance that came through that it was time for me to go to every single piece of land that I had ever had an experience with an abusive relationship on, starting with my home space where my father was an abusive alcoholic. And so fast forward 2 weeks, I said, yes, okay, I'll do that. I'll do a ceremony on all these pieces of land. So fast forward 2 weeks, the day that my son locked me in the basement, that whole day prior to that moment, I spent in conscious ceremony. And here's what I was doing. Starting with my childhood home, I went to the land. People, totally different people lived there. I knocked on the door, said, is it okay if I make a little ceremony here? And they were like, sure, yeah, you can do that. I went to the land and I opened sacred space and I made ceremonies such that I acknowledged, so we're going to go back to acknowledge again. I acknowledged that there was abuse that had happened in my relationship with the masculine on that land. And I admitted it to myself and acknowledged it to myself that, yes, indeed, I was one half of a dynamic where abuse was being perpetuated. And I made the conscious ceremony to heal that and to extract out of that experience with my father what was the gift that I now carry as a result of having been in this experience with my father. And then I did the exact same thing on 9 additional pieces of property, finally ending at my own home at the time. And then that night, after 3, my son had also been in 3 days of craziness, of addiction stuff, wild, just the drama. It's so crazy that things that were going on that the only place I had left to go, Ashley, was to spirit for help. There was no place else for me to go but to the spiritual for help with the craziness. And so I made ceremony on the land where I lived. And I went to journal my day. And about 10:30 that night, I heard a big bang in the basement. And my son had been literally either up raging or passed out cold for 3 days in a row. He would be raging and then passed out cold, raging and then passed out cold. And it took me all that time to figure out what was going on. He was actually high on homeopathic nasal spray, which was spiking his adrenaline and then causing him to pass out and go into ketosis. And when I went downstairs to find out what the big bang was, previous to that, earlier when he was out cold, I had seen that he was also ordering heroin and fentanyl online because he had left his computer open. And so I went downstairs and I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Leave me alone. I'm, get the hell out of my life. Leave me alone." And I said to him in that moment, "I can't. I really can't. I mean, I was down here earlier and I see you're ordering heroin and fentanyl online. I cannot leave you alone anymore." And that was, as soon as I said that to him, that was like the match to the gasoline. And he went completely crazy and jumped on top of me, threw me on the couch, hit me on the head with a water bottle, and, told me he was going to cut me up in little pieces and throw me in the river. Well, as that happened, again, the only place I could go was to the spiritual. And so I could not engage with crazy. I could not say anything. I chose consciously. I'm not saying a word. I'm just going into meditation. And I went into meditation and I surrendered my life. And I said, the only prayer I had was, if tonight's my last night, please just don't let it hurt too much. I just didn't want it to hurt too much. That was my prayer. And I just sat in meditation. A couple times I did ask, can I go to the bathroom? And the answer was, shut the fuck up, basically. You're not going anywhere. And each time I would feel like maybe I can ask, maybe I can probe, maybe I can engage. It was very clear. Nope, I got to surrender. I got to surrender. I got to surrender. And ultimately, he did go upstairs to get something to eat or go to the bathroom. And I heard very loudly in my mind. And as I was sitting in surrender, as I was sitting in meditation, my experience of this was that I was literally being held by the Master Jesus. Like I could feel the Master Jesus behind me and holding me. And that was my experience of it. And when my son went upstairs, I heard very clearly that I needed to go unlock the big door that led to our bulkhead. And as I'm unlocking the door to the bulkhead, I hear a thump, like this gigantic sound of something getting put on top of the bulkhead. At that point, I literally shit my pants. Mm-hmm. Literally. And then he came back down and he said, "And don't think you're getting out that way." And at that point, it was when I was like, okay, now I really have to surrender. I really have to surrender. Because even up until that point, I was still trying to calculate in my head, is there a way out? Is there a way out? Is there a way out? And I did have my phone with me, but I couldn't touch it and access it and do anything with it. And at that point, I simply surrendered and sent up the prayer. I just don't want it to hurt too much. So a little bit later, he went upstairs again. And when he went upstairs the second time, I heard very loudly in my head, "Go now." And so I went to the bulkhead, and I was able to get out. He had put a giant plant pot on it, but thankfully I had divine intervention that gave me the strength to get out of the bulkhead. And I left the property and ran to the forest and called the police. So that was what happened. Yeah, so that's what happened.
Wow. So, yeah. Okay, so this happens, and yeah. for many of us, I think everybody listening at this point, you realize the stress and the anxiety and the fear for your life was obviously, looming in your mind, and also, the fear for your son.
Totally.
That this is really, getting out of hand is obviously an understatement. So you've called the police. What happens next with the situation?
Well, actually, what I did first was I called his dad. And it's funny, when you have these old patterns of behavior, they're persistent as hell. Even though I had spent, 20 years in a contentious relationship with this man, and even though it was, there was never a good result of engaging with his father, I called his father first, and his father started yelling at me on the phone. I'm in the forest, in my pajamas, in the middle of the night, just got out of the basement. I'm calling his dad to get help. And he starts yelling at me. And I looked at my phone in that moment. Again, it's acknowledgement. Like, I looked at my phone in that moment and I said to myself, this isn't helping. Like, I looked for help in the wrong places. So I pushed the hang up button because he was yelling at me. And I was like, this isn't helping. I had the wake up call. And then I called the police. And when I called the police, Officer Friend, I couldn't believe it. Like, the mythology of it. I was like, are you kidding me? And that's how I know how divine and miraculous the whole thing was, because literally it was lifted to this mystic level of story. The person who came to get me out of the forest is Officer Friend. Officer Friend. Amazing. And so kind of fast forward, what happened was my son ended up going to jail. He spent a month in jail, which of course dried him out. And his father ended up getting him out. He went through the court process. He did get charged with felony kidnapping, which that was another whole part of the story that was kind of interesting. I had to make the choice to say to the sergeant. So after Officer Friend came and he took my story, then he called the sergeant, because basically what happened is that was considered felony kidnapping. And so when he called the sergeant said, this is felony kidnapping. And I, again, you know, these persistent old habits of wanting to protect the abuser reared up. And the sergeant said, this is felony kidnapping and we're going to need you to talk to the detectives. And in that moment, like literally my throat closed down. I could feel my throat closing down, and I could feel my heart as a mother, like struggling with, can I actually put a felony charge on my own son, right? And I am so grateful for the sergeant, because what the sergeant did in that moment was he took a look at me, and I was just like, he told me I needed to talk to the detectives. And I said, can I just breathe? Can I just breathe for a minute? Can I just breathe for a minute? Because I knew I had to make the decision whether or not to put a felony charge on my son. And so he looked at me and he said, the magic words, here's another divine intervention, right? He said the magic words, this will be your life. And I had already gone through 7 years of craziness with my son, okay? Plus another 40 some odd years of craziness with all the other men in my life. And I looked at that sergeant and I was like, oh, hell no, this is not going to be my life. I will talk to the detectives.
Wow, that's profound. That's very profound, because I think anybody listening right now, if you've been listening to my show in the past, you're listening to this show right now, you know that, we've talked about that old habits die hard, and many of us will protect the person because it's the way we brought up, it's the way we were raised, it's habit. So there you are in the situation, you're realizing
and
the writing on the wall.
Son.
Yeah.
Actually, he's my child. You
Yeah.
know? I mean, I literally gave birth to this being, right? And so I know his whole history. He was a premature baby. He had sexual assault in daycare when he was 3. He went through the divorce with my first husband. He had issues with my second husband. I knew my own child and had spent 20 years in this relationship with him. And so it was super, super challenging. And again, divine intervention. Thank you, God, for that sergeant, because he really did what I would call put my nose in the poop. He put my nose in the poop. Sometimes you need somebody to put your nose in the poop and to stop that repetitive pattern, right?
Right.
And I'm going to tell you right now, there is no question in my mind whatsoever that I would not be having this conversation with you today if I had not gone through that ceremony all day long that day of uprooting my literal energetic and psychological roots from the soil of abuse on every single piece of land that I ever lived on. I can tell you that 1,000,000,000,000,000,000,000% that we would not be talking today. Nor would I be able to celebrate the fact that my son is also healed as a result of the choices that I made that day. And yes, it took both of us time to process. So that's the final step, is you've got to give yourself time to process. Time is our friend, right? So I had to process the death of the model of mothering that I had played, the role of mother, the way I played that role of mother. I had to give myself the time to process the death of him as child and acknowledge he's now man. He went through whatever processes he went through, and now we're reconciled. He's healthy. He's got a girlfriend. He's got a good job. He's paying his way in the world. He's clean. He's awake, and he took responsibility at 22 years old, 2 years later almost. He sent me an extensive text of taking complete and full responsibility for his behavior and he acknowledged, so here we're back to acknowledgement, after whatever he's done for conscious ceremony, he acknowledged that it must have been horrible for me to witness him as he was trying to self-destruct. And he, at 22, was able to acknowledge that. And I wrote back to him and said, I hope you have awareness of how spiritually mature you are. Because at 22, you have a level of spiritual maturity that most people don't get in their whole life. So, it was big. And time to process, took us a year and a half before we could reconcile. But I also had to surrender any hope of staying attached to him. So during my time to process, I really allowed everything to die and acknowledged for myself that if I never saw him again, all is well. Like, I really had to grieve the potential of never seeing him again in this lifetime and accept that.
That's powerful. Right before we started the show today, I had a client in my office, and I was explaining the fact that a lot of times, based on the titles we've taken in our life, I believe to a certain degree that we do have soul contracts with people. But I believe that we put too much energy into the label, whether it's mother, father, sister, brother. And we have a tendency of living by that title and in the constructs of how we define that. And because of that, we have a tendency of not really jumping to the plate and being there and being aware and being mindful and being the friend to the person. Because when you really think about it, what Emerald is talking about and what I'd like to talk about, when you think about it, is had you had not pressed charges, had you had talked to that investigator, the detective, and done what most of us would have done, is to go in there, I don't want to do this, One, what that would have been doing is just aiding and abetting with the disease, with the problem. Another one would have been, codependency. And another thing would have been, nobody would have grown from this experience. And probably, unfortunately, you definitely wouldn't be here to have this conversation, because it would have probably happened again. And I feel that in order to be a friend to somebody, a spiritual friend, a guidance, you had to, and thank God you did, you had to do what needed to be done. Because some people would think, okay, well, I don't want to press charges because I want to protect them, when in reality, I'm aiding and abetting in their own self-destruction.
Totally.
Totally. And that's what I think we have to do, is we have to get rid of labels. Like, I've had issues with one of my parents, and it's something that we need to deal with. And and sometimes I try to avoid the conversation. But, I just want them to be healthy and happy, and I want them to acknowledge certain things too. And it can be hard when we're dealing with family members because we don't want to hurt feelings. We're totally attached. We have this soul contract. We have all this stuff. When in reality, we've got to be honest, because if we're not honest, we're screwed. And like you were saying, I like that when you said I had to be willing to take the chance that this person would be out of my life for the rest of my life, for the rest of their life. And I had to accept that. And I think all of us, when we're dealing with something of this extreme, it doesn't even have to be as extreme as the situation you just talked about. But when we're dealing with something, we've got to be honest and truthful in our own space. Because I think that's the only way that we all grow, no matter what the outcome.
Totally agreed. And, I do want to say to you, Ashley, if you've got issues in your own relationship with your parents, and I've got, one parent has passed and the other parent is still living and is somebody who's just not safe for me to be around, right? Like I had to acknowledge that it's not healthy for me to be around my mother. It's simply not healthy for me. And just because she gave birth to me and just because she has the role or the label of mother doesn't make her the nourishing mother that I want her to be. And as much as I'd like her to acknowledge some of the things that went down between us over time, I cannot make anybody acknowledge. The only thing I can do is make my own rite of passage and make my own act of power. And so, just to kind of codify this into 3 simple steps, it's an act, ACT, an act of power, where I acknowledge for myself that this relationship is not creating growth for either of us, and in fact is devolving as opposed to evolving. When I acknowledge that, then I can make the go to the conscious ceremony to honor the fact that this person has played a role for me. The role might be mother, the role might be son, the role might be friend, the role might be protector, whatever that role is. They have played a role for me and I have played a role for them. And so in my conscious ceremony, I acknowledge that we have both been playing a role, and I acknowledge the dynamic. So if it's abuse in this case, I acknowledge that in this role that we've played with each other, I have been the one who has played the role of being on the receiving end of abuse, and you have been the one who's played the role of being on the delivering end of abuse. And I am complete with playing my role, and I release you from playing your role. And that's forgiveness. To me, that is forgiveness. When we release ourselves and the other person from playing these roles, and we consciously, through ceremony, through ritual, acknowledge and extract out what was the lesson, what was the blessing, what was the gift that came as a result of us playing together. We've been playing these roles together. What was the gift? What was the result? What was the learning? So maybe for me, the learning in my relationship with my mother, the gift in my relationship with my mother was learning how to to recognize for myself what feels nourishing and what feels toxic. And then being able to and acknowledge the next gift, which is, oh my goodness, because of this relationship, I have learned about boundaries. I've learned about boundaries. This was something I needed to learn, and something I'm still learning is boundaries. And so when I go into conscious ceremony in this particular relationship where I forgive. It doesn't matter what they do. I forgive. I release them from playing that role. I harvest the gifts of what it is that whole dynamic offered to me. And then I allow the time to process and I give it up to spirit. That's what ceremony is all about. You just forgive, you release, and you give up to spirit whatever the results are going to be of that ceremony, and then sit in the state of grace, which is the time to process. And you've done everything that you can at that point. You've done everything that you can. And as a result of sitting in that state of grace and allowing the time to process, which is that final T, the time to process, ultimately you will have transited through your own self-created rite of passage, and you will find yourself in a whole new life. I can't tell you when. That's part of the magic, is the state of grace and the allowing the time to process.
I agree with transformed. That. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's really powerful. And because I think everybody listening to some degree has a family member, a brother or sister, mother, father, whatever, that, there's some issues there. And I know that I hear people often tell me, it's family, I just got to deal with it. It's family. I don't agree with that. You can't. I mean, there's certain times that you have to get real, and I think you have to be real all the time. And I agree with you, Emerald. And I think that the conversation has to be made. And I think going a step further is to acknowledge your feelings and thoughts. And I like that. I guess you call it an acronym, right? I like that because I think it's powerful, and I think everybody can use that to some degree because that's what we're going through. I think that we were given these challenges. And if we look at them as an opportunity, which they are, instead of the opposite, I think we realize the glimmer, the silver lining, and how we can process that and use that to empower ourselves on a daily basis, instead of looking at it as something hideous or horrible. And I think that's when we look at a limited process, but we don't have to live with it our whole life. Once we come to terms with it, it's time, like you said, to hold ceremony, the rite of passage, to leave that old thought process and limited thoughts behind and process into basically almost like a death, and accepting that and going through that ritual and moving forward, and then being able, like you say, to attach to that higher frequency.
Absolutely. And we must die to our old self in order to be reborn into a new possibility. We must die to our old self. And there's one final thing I want to say about acknowledgement. It's almost like we can come back again and again and again to the beginning of this process. Every time it's time for an act of power, we begin with acknowledgement. And so in August of last year, I got into insight, the guidance at that point, to acknowledge the gift of the sergeant, to really acknowledge the gift of the sergeant, right? Mm-hmm. Who put my nose in the poop and said, this is your life. We have a lot of stuff going on with police nowadays that it's, there's a lot of dense, heavy energy around police who are acting in ways that are, definitely detrimental and in some cases dangerous and deathly for many people who are in certain segments of our population. And so I want to acknowledge that we have a significant problem in the police departments, but I also want to acknowledge that there are people in the police departments like this sergeant who was willing and acting as a divine intervention, right? Through him, a divine intervention came when he put my nose in the poop and said, this will be your life. Because he sees it every day, right? Who knows better than the sergeant? Mm-hmm. So, basically what that did for me is really help me to recognize that I needed to now stop looking and attending to and acknowledging and putting my energy and power and life force into only seeing men who were abusive and addicted and alienated and alienating. And it woke me up. I was able to acknowledge, it woke me up to the awareness that it was time for me to start looking for and actively spotlighting and celebrating and, appreciating men on purpose. And so after I went through this whole experience where I made those acts and did those rites of passage for myself, where I acknowledged, where I had my conscious ceremony, where I gave myself the time to process, now we need to start in the new life, right? Now we need to step into, well, what do we want instead? And so as a result of this whole rite of passage for myself, now I find myself in an entirely new life. Thank you to this police officer. Thank you to my son. Thank you to myself for making the act of power and creating the rite of passage. And so now I am the hostess of the Men on Purpose podcast. And literally once a week, I have the pleasure of interviewing a man on purpose. And it's been immensely healing and immensely powerful for me to just focus myself in an entirely new direction. And of course, that's when magic starts to happen. Right, Ashley?
That's exactly when magic starts to happen, when we finally actually get to where we need to be at. And I find that profound. Tell me more about your podcast. Well,
so the purpose of the podcast is really to do exactly what I just said, which is elevate, celebrate, and spotlight men on purpose. And I would say that I had an inkling of what a man on purpose looked like about 5 years ago in 2013. I was still very embroiled in the, oh my God, all these men are just a nightmare, right? And I went to an event, and there was this man who got on the stage at this event. His name is Bert Jacobs, and he's the founder with his brother of the Life is Good company, which is a lifestyle brand and T-shirt company out of Boston. And this event was about 3 weeks after the Boston Marathon bombing. So now we have, here's the worst of what we can have experienced is, this Boston Marathon bombing. And here's this guy up on the stage. And what was beautiful about him is he's created this amazing, amazing company, right? First of all, he's created this amazing company that spreads this powerful, positive message that is dedicated. He's dedicated, him and his brother have dedicated their lives to spreading the power of optimism, right? And so all of that, as I'm witnessing this man on this stage speaking, my heart is starting to open and open and open. And then he gets to the point of his keynote where he brings to the table and to the audience of 1,000 people that one of his employees had been injured in the Boston Marathon, and he's crying on the stage. And I just lost it right then and there, Ashley. I'm like, oh my God, this man is crying on the stage. And so number one, he's a man on purpose. Number two, he's emotionally connected to his true feelings and fearless about showing them and sharing them. So he was kind of like my first model of a man on purpose. But I will have to say also that this policeman, this sergeant, who was willing to tell the truth, right? Who was willing to be the instrument through which the divine intervention came to allow me to make the decision that would be a healing for myself and for my son. That kind of activated the seed in me that said, you know what, it's time for me to look and act myself in service to showing not only myself, but the rest of the world that there are actually men on purpose out there. And so it's been a huge pleasure. I started the show in January, and so far we have listeners in 39 countries around the world. Yay. I had one guy who applied to be a guest on the show a few weeks ago, like maybe a month and a half ago, and he indicated that he found the show online somehow and became a binge listener. So the show is really designed to celebrate, elevate, and spotlight men, but it's also designed to serve the audience of what I call the men on purpose in the making out there in the world, who may not have even self-acknowledged that they are men on purpose, and they can use a little bit of motivation and inspiration and enlightenment and camaraderie from the men that I'm featuring. So it's been really awesome, and it's been very healing for me. And I feel like it's one of those win-win-win situations where I'm being of service to the world, I'm being service to myself, and I'm being of service to these men and to the men in the world in general who really could use even more visibility around their acts of goodness and truth and beauty.
That's beautiful. Emerald, I've enjoyed having you on, celebrating, elevating, and spotlighting, and really discussing the rite of passage. I think it's been profound. Everybody that's been listening to this, I think, are resonating with that higher frequency and connecting the dots in their own life. And I appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to having you back on the show in the future.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for having me and for all that you are doing to elevate the consciousness of the planet. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. A wonderful interview with Emerald. It's amazing when we think about how empowered we can be, our rites of passage, the value that means, what that serves. I think we have a tendency of rushing through life a lot, don't you? We have a tendency of sometimes seeing things very quickly, taking things for granted, but also taking ourselves for granted. The things that we go through, the real life struggles, the changes in our life that we have to get a hold of it. We've got to see it. We've got to deal with it. Sometimes we have to mourn the loss of various different things and the losses of our old self. Emerald's story, real life story, is profound. And I think it puts it in perspective for all of us. And, you know, when we actually deal with these situations and we become more real and authentic in our lifestyle and everything we do and everything we say and everything we believe and everything we think, our life just catapults into that amazing dimension and direction. And the power of that escalates, and our power, our internal positive power, radiates. So go out there today. Don't forget to celebrate your life. Don't forget to elevate it. Don't forget to allow some spotlight. You don't have to hide in the corner. You know what I'm saying? Because that's what I mean. When I talk about living your true life, it's about being authentic and real and true to yourself. Not hiding, not trying to conform, not having to be something that you're not having to deal with situations you don't need to, but just speaking the truth. And when we get rid of those labels and we shed some of those labels, we can really get to that next level of life by being a friend to everybody and helping them to even help them find and celebrate and elevate and spotlight their own life. I appreciate Emerald Greenforest for coming on the show, and I appreciate all of you who listen and are connected to the show, because it's our group, it's our tribe, it's our way of life, it's our higher frequency. Live Your True Life Perspectives with me, your host, Ashley Berges, will be back in. You know I'll be back this time in 3 shakes.